of cannabis will be dealt with.
James-Assiniboia-Headingley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour to rise and speak in support of C-45, an act respecting cannabis, and to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code, and other acts. At its core, Bill C-45 allows individuals above the minimum age of 18 to purchase cannabis from a licensed retailer and possess a maximum of 30 grams. This legislation also allows for home cultivation with up to 4 plants per residence and ensures that access to cannabis for medical purposes will be maintained. The bill has 3 specific objectives. It creates a legal and regulated market for cannabis to take profits out of the hands of criminal and organized crime. It protects public health through strict product requirements for safety and quality, and it imposes strict, serious criminal penalties for those who provide cannabis to young people. Criminalized in 1923 under the Act to prohibit the improper use of opium and other drugs, the reasons why the possession, manufacturing, and purchase of cannabis should be illegal was hardly debated. As parliamentarians, it is our obligation to debate to the best of our ability the critical issues facing Canadians here in this important institution and to create the laws that protect them and their inalienable rights. Today, we can have that debate that never occurred in 1923. Mr. Speaker, the prohibition on cannabis has failed. It victimizes ordinary Canadians, and it emboldens criminal elements in our society. The current prohibition on cannabis disproportionately targets minority groups in Canada and has altered the lives of anyone who received a criminal conviction for carrying a small amount of marijuana, including lost employment opportunities, immigration issues, social stigma of being branded a criminal, and imprisonment. Mr. Speaker, it is worse than the problem it was designed to protect us from. Our government acknowledges that the current prohibition on cannabis does not work, and now is the time to take an evidence-based approach. As an emergency room physician, I have seen many tragic things. This includes the effects of prohibition on Canadians. The effects that I have witnessed ranged from organized criminals targeting citizens to instill fear in a community, to the murdering of competitors to protect their profits, and the killing of innocent bystanders. This is the impact of prohibition that I know and I have seen. Just as an aside, during my time in the emergency room, I have resuscitated patients who have overdosed on opioids, cocaine, and it should be noted, Mr. Speaker, alcohol. But never have I had to resuscitate anyone who was only under the influence of marijuana. The only true beneficiaries of prohibition are the criminals who profit from it. Much like the prohibition on alcohol in America in the 1920s, organized criminals continue to see a lucrative opportunity in today's prohibition. By legalizing and regulating cannabis, we can take revenue away from those who terrorize communities and take loved ones away from their families. I understand that many people have concerns about this legislation and our youth. Everyone in this House, me included, is concerned about young Canadians using cannabis. But right now, it is easier for children to acquire marijuana than it is for them to acquire tobacco or alcohol, with our youth having some of the highest rates of cannabis use in the world. Drug dealers don't ask to see identification or verify someone's age. When we regulate a product, like we do for cigarettes and alcohol, we can restrict its usage to persons above a certain age and ensure there are consequences for those who provide it to them. The legislation creates 2 new criminal convictions: giving or selling cannabis to youth and using youth to commit a cannabis-related offense. This legislation does 3 things to protect children. Creates a minimum age of 18 years for the purchase of cannabis, although provinces and territories have the right to increase this age. It provides for public education and awareness campaigns of the dangers associated with cannabis. And it requires child-proof packaging and warning labels. This also prohibits product or packaging that are appealing to youth, selling cannabis through a self-service display or vending machines, and promoting cannabis except in narrow circumstances where the promotion could not be seen by a young person. At this moment, there is no product safety in the recreational cannabis market. Cannabis sold by organized criminals could be laced with harmful pesticides or herbicides or other dangerous drugs. I am keenly aware of this because I have treated patients who smoke cannabis, but were not aware that it contains something else. The legislation protects the consumers of cannabis by implementing industry-wide rules and standards on basic things such as sanitary production requirements, a prohibition on the use of unauthorized pesticides, product testing for THC levels and the presence of contaminants, and restrictions on the use of ingredients and additives. These are minor standards that we hold so many companies and producers of innocuous items accountable for. And for too long, there was a product used by many Canadians who were not aware if the product used pesticides, contaminants, or was laced with a dangerous substance. Essentially, consumers have to take organized criminals on their word that what they're consuming is not dangerous. Our government will be investing additional resources to make sure there is appropriate capacity within Health Canada, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Canada Border Services Agency, and the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness to license, inspect, and enforce all aspects of the proposed legislation. One of the concerns that have been brought up to me by my constituents is persons who are under the influence of cannabis and who are operating a motor vehicle. And their concerns are completely valid. Evidence shows that cannabis does in fact impair an individual's ability to drive. Impaired driving is the leading criminal cause of death and injury in Canada, and rates of drug-impaired driving are increasing. In 2015, there were more than 72,000 impaired driving incidents reported by the police, including almost 3,000 drug-impaired driving incidents. That is why our government also introduced Bill C-46 at the same time it introduced C-45. C-46 proposes a significant modernization of the impaired driving provisions in the Criminal Code and is designed to protect the health and safety of Canadians by creating new and stronger laws to deter and severely punish impaired driving. This legislation also provides law enforcement with the tools and resources they need to improve detection and prosecution of impaired driving. C-46 proposes to strengthen law enforcement's ability to detect drug-impaired drivers by authorizing the use of roadside oral fluid screening devices. Canadian police forces have tested devices designed to detect cannabis as well as other drugs in a driver's saliva. Police have been asking for these resources, and we will deliver. Mr. Speaker, there have been concerns that this legislation will lead to widespread cannabis use. In fact, there is already widespread cannabis use in Canada, and our rates of usage among youth and adults are the highest and higher than other jurisdictions that have legalized marijuana. Mr. Speaker, our society is dealing with a myriad of problems due to cannabis, but most of them are in fact caused by its prohibition. This legislation will take revenue away from organized criminals, implement, for the first time in Canada, safety standards, and actually solve many of the problems and make it harder for our youth to acquire marijuana. This legislation will make Canada a safer place for all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Bellechasse.
The Honourable Member for Bellechasse, Les Échemins, Lévis. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The member opposite said that Canada was facing a number of problems and that the government's approach was based on science. However, in Colorado, there isn't 1, 2, or 3, but 7 factors that are detrimental. There's been an increased consumption among young people, and they're consuming earlier. Arrests, people are arrested with more drugs. There are more deadly accidents. So there are a number of issues. Did the government learn any lessons from this? Because when we look at Bill C-45 and we look at what's happening in Colorado and the science, we see that it's actually devastating. So why launch into this type of an adventure that's going to create more problems? And it's not proven by science.
Charleswood-St. James-Assiniboia-Headingley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for his question. I agree that it is, if we are legalizing this, we should look to other jurisdictions that have legalized it. Now, the data that the member is quoting from Colorado, I'm wondering what sources that he is using. 2 sources that I have been using from Colorado are a report issued by the Chief Public Health Officer of Colorado, and a report by the Public Safety Department of Colorado that have both said that there have been some increases, although the data they admit is very, very hard to interpret because up until now they have not been tracking this. So to compare what was happening before the data was being tracked to what is happening today does not make much sense in the way of comparison. And even the comparisons that they are making are not showing these effects to be devastating. They are showing that there are some effects, some negative effects, but it is unsure whether these actually reach statistical significance.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kootenay-Columbia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the honourable member from Charleswood-St. James-Assiniboia-Headingley for his work as an emergency physician, and because I used to live in Winnipeg as well. I do have one question because I really am confused by it. And in the proposed legislation, it will allow a young person between the ages of 12 and 18 to possess up to 5 grams of dried cannabis without criminal sanction. And there's also a social sharing provision where youth can share up to 5 grams without being accused of trafficking or transport. To me, that just flies in the face of trying to protect youth. And so I'd be really interested in hearing the members' views.
The honourable member for Charleswood-St. James-Assiniboia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is a misinterpretation of that statute. In fact, this does not legally permit anyone between the ages of 12 and 18 to carry marijuana. What it does, there is basically a ticketing offense that does not lead to a criminal record, and contrary to what an earlier speaker says, the substance is in fact confiscated. So there is a sanction for this, just not a criminal record.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the 1920s, prohibition was a terrible failure for alcohol. And criminals profited from it. People died from the consumption of it because alcohol, there was no tight regulatory regime controlling alcohol or over the consumption, composition, I should say, of alcohol. So fast forward to today. And the same thing, the miserable, terrible failure of marijuana. Criminals are profiting from it. There is no control over the composition of marijuana. But you now look at alcohol today. There are tight controls, a tight regulatory regime over alcohol, and it's created a much more responsible environment around the consumption of alcohol and, more importantly, the composition of alcohol. So would the member not agree that by ending prohibition of cannabis will actually be beneficial to society? Thank you.
The honourable member for Charleswood-St. James-Assiniboia-Headingley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would agree with the honourable member. As I've said, in my own medical practice, I have had patients who came in who had consumed what they thought was simply cannabis. And in fact, what they came in was with obvious toxic syndromes consistent with other ingestions. It was clear that nothing else had been ingested to their mind. But what in fact had happened, as we have said, there's not a lot of quality control in a substance that is produced by criminal gangs. And we had people seriously ill based on the contaminants that were put in. This will lead to a strictly regulated product that is not available to the public unless it is subject to strict quality controls, like we now have today with alcohol.